She helped a lost boy. Suddenly, a millionaire's car collection pulled up to her house. It was one of those evenings when the world felt heavier than usual, the kind of evening where the quiet in the air carried more weight than comfort, and Emma, exhausted from her long shift at the small-town diner, dragged her weary feet along the cracked pavement, clutching her worn-out jacket tighter against the creeping chill of the night. The street lamps buzzed weakly overhead, casting pools of yellow light that barely cut through the darkness of the quiet American suburb, and every sound of her footsteps echoed louder than normal, reminding her of the loneliness that often followed her home. She had spent the entire day balancing trays, forcing smiles, and listening to customers complain while counting the few tips that would barely pay her overdue rent. And now, all she wanted was to collapse on her second-hand couch and forget how hard life kept pressing her down. But then, just as she rounded the corner into the narrow street that led to her tiny apartment, her ears caught something faint, something so fragile that it immediately pulled her heart away from her own tiredness. It wasn't the rustle of leaves, nor the distant hum of a television through a neighbor's window. It was softer, thinner, like the cry of a small bird caught in the cold, and Emma froze, straining to listen. There it was again, a sound of broken sobs, muffled but desperate, and it made her chest tighten. Following the sound, she spotted a figure sitting small and crumpled at the edge of the sidewalk under the dim glow of a flickering lamppost. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, with his arms wrapped tightly around his knees as if making himself smaller could somehow protect him from the world. His cheeks were wet with tears that glistened under the weak light, and his voice cracked as he whispered the same words over and over again. "I want to go home. I want to go home." The kind of repetition born from fear and confusion rather than hope. Emma's heart ached at the sight, and though exhaustion still pulled at her bones, instinct pushed her forward, her shoes scraping softly against the concrete as she approached with cautious steps. She noticed immediately that his clothes did not belong to her neighborhood. The boy's jacket looked expensive, the kind that only wealthy families could afford, and his sneakers were spotless even though the ground around them was dusty and stained. Something about him looked completely out of place in this street of peeling paint and broken mailboxes, and that contrast sent a shiver of unease through her. Kneeling slowly so she wouldn't startle him, Emma softened her voice, letting it carry warmth instead of alarm, and said, "Sweetheart, are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy lifted his head, eyes wide and shimmering with tears, his lashes wet and clumped together, and for a moment he looked at her as if trying to decide whether she was safe enough to trust. His lower lip trembled before he sniffled, a shaky sound that seemed too big for such a small chest, and he whispered, I don't know. They're gone." His words cut into Emma like a blade, not because she fully understood yet, but because the helplessness in his tone carried a weight she recognized from her own childhood, the weight of not knowing who to turn to when the world felt too large and too cruel. She wanted to ask more, to press gently for answers about what "gone" really meant, whether they had walked away, whether he had been left, or whether something worse had happened. But just as her lips parted to speak, the sharp glare of headlights sliced across the corner of the street. The beam caught her off guard, spilling light over her and the boy, almost blinding her in the sudden brightness, and her heart jumped into her throat. The car wasn't moving fast. It was idling, lingering just far enough away to be hidden in shadow, and yet close enough for her to feel its presence pressing against her nerves. The boy noticed it too, stiffening instantly, his grip on his knees tightening until his knuckles turned white. The sound of the engine purred low, steady, like a predator waiting for the right moment, and Emma's stomach turned cold. She shielded the boy instinctively with her body, her tiredness forgotten, her instincts screaming louder than her fear. Someone was watching them. Emma's pulse still hammered from the moment those headlights froze her in their glare, and though the car eventually rolled back into the night, its lingering presence gnawed at her nerves until she finally gathered the courage to take the boy's trembling hand and lead him toward the narrow path that wound to her apartment. The night air seemed colder now, every sound exaggerated, the crunch of her footsteps on the gravel, the squeak of the gate as she pushed it open, the distant barking of a dog down the block. And she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting those headlights to reappear at any second. Inside her home, the tiny living room greeted them with its peeling wallpaper, the sagging couch, and the faint hum of the old refrigerator that always ran too loud. But despite its worn appearance, it was safe, and safety was all she could offer him. She set the boy down on the couch, noticing how small he looked compared to the torn cushions, his eyes still darting nervously toward the door as if afraid it might burst open at any second. Emma rummaged through her almost empty fridge and returned with the simplest comfort she could provide, a sandwich, hastily made from the last of her bread and peanut butter, and placed it gently in his hands. He stared at it for a moment as though it were a treasure, then nibbled slowly, each bite softening down, fear carved into his face. Emma grabbed an old but clean blanket from the armchair and wrapped it carefully around his shoulders, tucking it in the way she imagined a mother might, her heart swelling with an ache she couldn't quite name. "You're safe here," she murmured, and after a long silence, the boy finally whispered his name, almost too quiet to hear. Ethan. The name hung in the air, tender and fragile, making him more real, less of a mystery. And yet with that name came a dozen questions Emma dared not ask, not yet, not when he was still shaking. But even as Ethan began to settle, leaning into the warmth of the blanket, Emma's attention was pulled elsewhere, for from the corner of her eye, through the thin curtains, she noticed movement. Her breath caught. Just beyond the reach of her dim porch light, under the lonely glow of the street lamp, a figure stood half hidden in the shadows, still and silent, watching. The shape was tall, indistinct, the kind of presence that felt intentional, not accidental, and every instinct in Emma's body screamed that whoever it was had not stumbled there by chance. Her heart kicked against her ribs, faster and harder with each second she kept her gaze on that silhouette, and questions swirled violently in her mind. Who was he? Was this the same car that had idled at the corner earlier? Was he following Ethan? And if so, why? Emma's throat tightened, her palms damp as she pulled the curtain shut quickly, forcing herself to breathe. She didn't want Ethan to see her fear, so she pushed the dread down, turned back to him, and managed a weak smile before pulling him into her arms. His small body trembled against hers, but she tightened her hold, whispering into his hair, "Don't worry. I'll protect you. No one is going to hurt you." The words sounded brave, but inside she felt anything but. And as Ethan finally rested his head on her shoulder, trusting her more than she trusted herself, she slipped quietly back toward the window. With her hand trembling, she lifted the curtain just an inch, her eye peeking through the crack to see if the figure still remained. The street lamp flickered once, buzzing faintly in the night, and her stomach twisted with dread as she searched the shadows where the man had been. But the space was empty now. The figure was gone. The silence of the night had left Emma restless, sleep broken into fragments filled with shadows and questions she couldn't silence. And when morning finally pushed its pale light through the thin curtains, she felt no relief, only the weight of what she had seen and the uncertainty of what it meant. Ethan stirred quietly on the couch, his small frame still wrapped in the blanket, his eyes blinking open with the kind of fragility that only comes after a night of fear. Emma moved to the small kitchenette, poured 2 cups of water, and brought one to him, forcing a smile she didn't feel, because what else could she offer except the illusion of calm? Sitting across from him, she leaned forward gently, careful not to scare him with the urgency pressing at her chest, and asked, "Ethan, where did you last see your parents?" For a moment he said nothing, only staring at the chipped edge of the cup in his hands, his brows furrowed as though he were weighing every word. Finally, his voice broke the stillness, soft and almost reluctant. "Daddy has a lot of cars, and people are always after him." The statement landed like a stone in Emma's stomach, heavy and unsettling, and she froze in place, her breath catching as the meaning clawed its way into her mind. A lot of cars, people chasing. She replayed those words, the puzzle pieces shifting into something far larger than she was ready for. Was his father wealthy, so wealthy that danger followed him everywhere? Was that why a figure had been watching her house last night? Why headlights had lingered in the dark? The thought sent a sharp chill down her spine, and though she wanted to press Ethan for more, his eyes had dropped, his small fingers twisting the blanket as if he already regretted saying too much. Before she could ask again, a sudden knock rattled the front door, sharp and hurried, making her heart leap. She stood cautiously, pulling the door open only a crack, and there stood Mrs. Callahan, her elderly neighbor with a stern face and a reputation for knowing everyone's business. Her voice was low but urgent as she leaned closer. "Emma, I saw men circling your house last night. Strangers, not from around here. Be careful. You don't know whose kid that is." Emma swallowed hard, her stomach turning to knots as fear clawed at her insides, the truth pressing down harder with every warning. She looked back at Ethan, still small and fragile on her couch, and the weight of responsibility nearly crushed her. She wanted to help him, to keep him safe, but every new detail sharpened the danger around them, whispering that she was stepping into something far bigger than she could handle. She closed the door slowly, leaning against it as her pulse thundered, her mind spinning with the thought that she was now standing at the center of someone else's storm. Was she protecting a lost child, or shielding the son of a man powerful enough to have enemies? She could hardly think straight, the mixture of compassion and dread colliding inside her, and in that moment, the air outside shifted with a sound that ripped her away from her spiraling thoughts. At first, it was faint, distant, a low hum in the morning stillness, but quickly it grew louder, deeper, rolling like a wave of thunder drawing closer. Emma's head snapped toward the window, her body tense and her eyes widened in disbelief. The unmistakable roar of multiple engines surged down her street, not one, not two, but several. The sound of raw power tearing through the calm suburb, shaking the fragile walls of her home. The roar grew louder until it felt like the ground itself trembled beneath Emma's feet, and unable to resist the pull of dread and curiosity, she hurried to the door, flung it open, and stepped out into the blinding daylight. The sight before her made her freeze in place, her breath caught somewhere between awe and terror, because rolling down the narrow suburban street were sleek black supercars, one after another, their polished surfaces gleaming like predators under the morning sun. Their engines growled low and powerful, each rumble vibrating through the air, commanding attention, swallowing the quiet of the neighborhood whole. Neighbors spilled from their houses, startled at first, then quickly entranced, phones raised high as they began recording the bizarre spectacle unfolding in what was usually a forgotten corner of town. Emma's throat tightened as she counted car after car, the line of exotic machines stretching farther than her eyes could track, each one parking with precision, nose to tail, until her small street looked nothing like the place she had walked home from just last night. Doors began opening with crisp clicks, and from the first car stepped men dressed in dark, tailored suits, their movements sharp and deliberate, scanning the area with the alert focus of bodyguards, eyes sweeping across rooftops, windows, and every onlooker who dared inch too close. Their presence was overwhelming, like a storm descending, and Emma felt a chill crawl down her spine. Behind her, she felt Ethan's tiny hand slip into hers, clutching with a desperation that made her heart clench, and when she turned her head to look, his face had gone pale, his eyes wide with a terror too deep for words. His voice cracked as he whispered, "They found me." The words pierced Emma, slicing through any illusion she still held that this was some misunderstanding. Her pulse raced, pounded, rang in her ears as she tried to make sense of it. Were these men here to return him safely to his family, or was there something darker at play, something connected to the shadows that had lingered near her house the night before? Every instinct inside her screamed at her to protect him, yet her mind spun helplessly through 100 scenarios, none of them clear, none of them safe. The men in suits moved with chilling coordination, positioning themselves like a wall of silent power, their eyes hard, their faces unreadable, and the air thickened with the weight of their presence. Emma could feel the neighbors' stares burning into her, could hear their hushed whispers rising in confusion and fear, and all she wanted to do was pull Ethan back inside and lock the door forever. But before she could move, one of the men suddenly paused, his gaze snapping directly to her house, as though he had known exactly where to look all along. Emma's stomach dropped, her grip tightening protectively around Ethan's trembling hand, as the man lifted his arm and pointed, clear, deliberate, unmistakable, straight at her. And then, without hesitation, he began walking toward her. Emma's breath caught as the suited man closed the distance with long, purposeful strides, the weight of his presence pressing harder with each step, until he stood just a few feet away, towering over her, with a face carved in sharp lines of authority and power. The silence stretched unbearably before he slowly reached up, removed his sleek black sunglasses, and for the first time allowed his eyes to meet Ethan's. The transformation was immediate. Those hard, calculating eyes softened, widened, and filled with something raw and unguarded. "Ethan!" he gasped, his voice breaking in a way that revealed more than any words could. And before Emma could even process what was happening, he rushed forward, sweeping the boy into his arms with a desperation that spoke of nights spent in fear and days of searching without rest. He held Ethan tightly, burying his face into the child's hair as tears welled in his eyes, his voice trembling as he choked out, "Thank God. Thank God. I thought I lost you forever." Ethan clung to him with the same relief, his small arms circling his father's neck, and the sight struck Emma like lightning, so unexpected, so intimate, that she could only stand frozen on the porch, her heart caught between disbelief and the flood of emotions rising around her. Finally she found her voice, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You're his father." The man turned to her, still holding Ethan close, and nodded, his features tightening, as though holding back another wave of emotion. "Yes," he said firmly, the authority returning to his tone, but not disguising the gratitude shining in his eyes. "I'm Richard Bennett, and you've saved my son." The name meant nothing to Emma at first, but the weight of the suits, the supercars, the whispered reputation she had only caught in fragments from neighbors, it all collided in her head until her knees felt unsteady. She had not stumbled into an ordinary family crisis. She had stumbled into the orbit of someone powerful, someone whose world was far removed from her own cracked walls and empty fridge. She wanted to ask 100 questions, to understand how Ethan had ended up alone and terrified on her street, but before she could form the words, one of the bodyguards stepped forward swiftly, leaning close to Richard and murmuring something urgent into his ear. Richard's expression shifted instantly, his relief collapsing under the weight of something darker, heavier, and his jaw tightened as though every muscle in his body had braced for impact. Emma watched uneasily as the warmth in his face hardened into steel, his eyes darting toward the edges of the street, scanning the shadows like a man who knew danger was never far behind. Ethan clung tighter to him, sensing the shift, and Emma felt her own pulse quicken, the dread she had carried since last night surging back with greater force. When Richard finally turned his gaze back to her, it carried both gratitude and warning, his words measured but sharp with urgency. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Someone dangerous is after Ethan, and now you're part of this too." Richard's sharp command cut through the tension, and within seconds his men moved like shadows, positioning themselves with trained precision, their presence transforming Emma's once quiet street into something that felt more like a stronghold than a neighborhood. The sleek, gleaming supercars that had first arrived with mystery now formed a barricade of wealth and power, their polished hoods glowing under the orange streetlights, as if they were soldiers standing at attention. Neighbors peeked out from windows, phones pressed against glass, some daring to step onto porches to gawk openly, whispering among themselves in disbelief at the surreal spectacle. Emma, the girl they all knew as the waitress scraping by, standing at the center of it all. The contrast was staggering. Her modest home, with peeling paint and a flickering porch light, suddenly flanked by machines worth more than anything she could imagine. Machines that reflected not only headlights, but the heavy truth of a world colliding with hers. Richard stood firm, his arm still protective around Ethan, his gaze sweeping the perimeter until satisfied his men had secured the area, and then he turned back to Emma, his voice carrying a gravity that pressed into her chest like the weight of the night itself. "You risked everything for my boy," he said, the gratitude in his tone woven tightly with the fatigue of a man who had seen too much. "I owe you more than you can imagine." The words landed heavily, not as empty promises, but as a vow, and Emma's heart pounded in her chest, torn between disbelief and a strange warmth rising in her throat. She wanted to speak, to tell him she hadn't thought of danger or reward when she knelt beside Ethan on the curb, that all she had seen in that moment was a lost child who needed her. But the lump in her throat kept her silent. Richard's eyes lingered on her, as if he saw more thieves, and just a struggling young woman, as if he understood that kindness had cost her something invisible, something no riches could measure. Around them, the rumble of engines filled the night as the cars repositioned, their growl echoing down the block and rattling windows, a sound that spoke of both protection and menace. Emma glanced at her neighbors once more, seeing their wide-eyed stares, their whispered questions. Poor Emma, standing side by side with a billionaire whose men patrolled like secret agents. Her life had never been a stage before, but tonight it was, and she could feel the weight of every gaze pressed upon her. Richard gave another order, and slowly, one by one, the cars began to roll away, their headlights cutting through the darkness like blades of light. Their presence receding, but leaving behind an imprint too strong to ever fade. Ethan, still clutching his father's hand, turned back toward Emma, his eyes filled with a trust and affection that made her chest tighten. And in that small, innocent look, she understood that no matter how loud the engines or how vast the wealth surrounding him, the boy remembered who had first reached for him when he was most alone. As the last of the convoy pulled from the street, the rumble fading into the distance, the silence that followed was almost deafening, a silence that left Emma standing in the glow of her porch light, her breath catching as the enormity of it all washed over her. She hadn't wanted thanks, hadn't wanted anything but to ease the tears of a lost child, yet that single act of kindness had woven her life into a story far larger, far stranger than anything she could have imagined. She looked down at her trembling hands, feeling the ghost of Ethan's small grip still clinging to her, and knew with bone-deep certainty that something had shifted forever. The world she had known, lonely shifts at the diner, quiet walks home, the silence of her empty house, was gone. In its place stood a new fate, one tied to secrets, to wealth, to danger, and perhaps even to a chance at something greater than survival. As the night air settled and the final echo of engines disappeared into the horizon, Emma whispered to herself in disbelief, realizing with chilling clarity that her life would never, ever be the same.